The scent of lilies and cold marble hung in the air as mourners filled the chapel, their whispers blending into a dull murmur beneath the somber organ notes. Luna's funeral was meant to be a quiet farewell, a moment for the living to release their grief into something gentler than guilt. Yet even before the service began, tension was coiled around every gaze. The Spencers sat in solemn formation, their grief sharp and visible, while across the aisle, the Forresters tried to maintain their composed elegance. The truce between the two families was delicate, fragile as the petals scattered across the casket. No one spoke much. Silence had become safer than truth. Will stood apart, his hands trembling as he stared at the polished wood that held what remained of Luna. He had not slept since the night of the accident. Her laughter still echoed in his mind, cruel in its brightness. He wanted to believe that the tragedy had been fate, a cruel twist of chance that could be mourned, not explained. But grief has a way of pulling the curtain back on illusions. Even now, he sensed that something darker was waiting, something that refused to stay buried with her body. The priest began his eulogy, voice steady and detached, speaking of peace, of forgiveness, of endings that promised beginnings elsewhere. But halfway through, the heavy doors at the back of the chapel creaked open, and the whispering stopped. A man stepped inside, his figure cutting through the rows of mourners like a shadow made of flesh. His coat was dark, his expression unreadable, and when he moved, there was a deliberate slowness, as if each step carried purpose rather than grief. He reached the altar, ignoring the startled glances, and requested to speak. No one moved to stop him, though instinctively everyone leaned back, creating a gap around him. His voice, when it came, was calm and chillingly precise. He said he was the one who had been behind the wheel the night Luna died. The words detonated through the room like a bomb. Gasps rippled across the crowd. Will's breath caught in his throat, his body frozen as the man continued, saying that he had not acted alone, that he had been paid to do it, and the person who had hired him was Electra. The silence that followed was so deep it felt like a physical blow. For a long moment, no one spoke. Electra, sitting near the front beside Hope, did not move. Her eyes went wide, then blank, as if her mind had separated from her body. Bill rose slowly, his face turning from shock to fury. His voice thundered across the chapel, shattering the stillness. "Explain yourself." The man gave a name, a date, an amount. His story was too specific to be dismissed as madness. He claimed Electra had approached him through an intermediary, promising a payout large enough to erase his debts if he made Luna's car disappear off the road. Will staggered back, his vision blurring. The woman he had clung to as his last hope, his reason for trying to live after Luna's death, was being accused of orchestrating it. He wanted to scream that it was a lie, that Luna's death had been a cruel accident. But the man's tone left little room for denial. He described details that only someone there could know: the curve of the road, the make of Luna's car, the way she tried to swerve too late. Electra stood at last, her face pale but her spine straight. "That's not true," she said, her voice trembling but clear. Yet in that moment, her denial seemed powerless against the tidal wave of accusation already rising. Bill turned to her, his expression unreadable, a mixture of paternal rage and disbelief. The man continued to speak, each sentence tightening the noose around her name. The funeral dissolved into chaos. Reporters who had been quietly attending out of respect began to whisper into phones. Security moved closer. Ridge Forrester, seeing the danger, stepped forward to steady the situation, urging calm and insisting that the accusation was a setup, a malicious attempt to destroy both Electra and the Forrester name. Brooke joined him, arguing that no evidence had been presented, that grief could make men lie for money or vengeance. But Bill would not be silenced. He turned the front of the chapel into an impromptu interrogation chamber. His voice, once a father's lament, had become a prosecutor's weapon. He demanded details: the route, the contact, the payment trail. The man's answers were quick, almost rehearsed, but precise. When Bill asked for proof, The man revealed a single folded document from his coat pocket, a bank transfer signed by a holding company Electra had briefly consulted for. It was not direct proof, but enough to ignite suspicion. Steffi and Thomas exchanged glances from their pew, aware that every word spoken now was being recorded in the minds of those who would later spin it into headlines. The Forresters' lawyers, seated discreetly in the back, were already on their phones, trying to contain the narrative. Ridge, seeing where this was heading, placed a hand on Electra's shoulder, signaling her not to say another word. But it was too late. Her silence had already begun to sound like guilt. Will could no longer stay seated. He approached the altar, his body shaking, his eyes fixed on the man who had confessed. "Why now?" he asked hoarsely. "Why would you come here, to her funeral, to say this?" The man met his gaze with something that looked almost like pity. "Because," he said, "she deserves the truth." Will's knees nearly buckled. He looked at Electra, at the woman who had held him while he cried for Luna, who had promised that they would heal together, and saw not comfort but confusion, desperation, and fear. He could not tell whether she was terrified because she was innocent or because she had been caught. The thought alone made him sick. Bill, sensing his son's collapse, stepped in. He turned the interrogation toward the practical. If this man was telling the truth, then who had sent him the money? Could it be traced? Could they verify it through the bank? Justin Barber, standing near the back, was already making calls to their legal contacts, digging for confirmation. Meanwhile, the Forrester camp went into damage control. Brooke whispered urgently to Ridge that this had to be sabotage, someone exploiting the Spencer grief to drag their name through scandal. But the scene had already taken on a life of its own. Guests began whispering, taking sides, their sympathies dividing like fault lines. Some believed the man, citing his knowledge of the accident. Others argued that grief could twist memory and morality alike. The priest, realizing the sanctity of the service had been shattered, quietly stepped back, his hands trembling. Electra finally spoke again, but this time not to defend herself, to plead. She turned to Will, her eyes glistening. "You know me," she said. "You know I could never." But he stepped away. His silence was worse than accusation. It was the silence of someone who no longer knew what to believe. The media storm began within the hour. By nightfall, every outlet from Los Angeles to Paris carried the same headline: hit-and-run confession at Luna Nozawa's funeral, Electra implicated. The footage of the stranger's statement spread online, dissected by journalists, conspiracy theorists, and fans alike. The Forresters called an emergency meeting at the mansion, while the Spencers gathered at Bill's estate, each side framing the event through their own lens of betrayal. Bill, ever the tactician, treated it like a war room. "If she did this," he told Will, "then we end her." But Will didn't respond. He sat by the window, staring into the night, unable to reconcile the two women who now lived in his memory: Luna, the one he couldn't save, and Electra, the one who might have caused it. He remembered Luna's last words, her laughter, her apology, and wondered if all of it had been leading to this moment. Meanwhile, across town, Ridge and Brooke fought to contain the crisis. Ridge believed Electra had been framed. Brooke wasn't sure. Hope, caught between loyalty to her family and her sympathy for Will, feared the damage this would do to the entire fashion world. "If this gets out," she told Ridge, "it's not just our name, it's every model, every campaign, every investor." Ridge knew she was right. The scandal would ripple far beyond their family. By dawn, the man who had made the accusation vanished. Police were searching for him, but no trace remained. No address, no identification, only a burned-out car found miles from the city. That disappearance deepened the mystery. Was he telling the truth, or had he been part of a larger game? Bill suspected a setup. Ridge feared a trap. Steffi wondered if someone was using Luna's death as leverage for something greater. The following days became a blur of statements and counter-statements, of press conferences and investigations. Electra maintained her innocence, but every denial seemed to make her look more guilty. Forrester's lawyers argued that her name was being used to manipulate Forrester's stock value, pointing to rival companies that had shorted their shares right before the funeral. Bill wasn't convinced. He began to dig into her financial history himself. Will, torn between rage and heartbreak, confronted Electra privately. He asked her not for an explanation, but for the truth. "If you did this," he whispered, "tell me now, before the world does." She swore she hadn't. Her voice broke, her hands shaking as she tried to reach for him. "I loved her too," she said. But Will couldn't bear to hear it. He walked away, leaving her alone in the echoing hall. The scandal split the city in two. Designers pulled contracts, magazines postponed features, and charity events once meant to honor Luna's memory became minefields of speculation. Finn, still haunted by Luna's death, began to assist the police quietly, hoping to find some factual thread that could untangle the web. What he discovered instead was more alarming. The supposed hitman's bank records had been altered. The signature wasn't Electra's, it was forged. But the forgery was expert, the kind that required inside knowledge of Forrester's systems. Someone had gone to great lengths to make her appear guilty. The revelation reignited the war. Bill accused Forrester of fabricating evidence to protect one of their own. Ridge accused Spencer Publications of weaponizing grief to smear their rivals. The investigation widened, exposing old rivalries and corporate espionage buried beneath the veneer of fashion and glamour. Through it all, Will unraveled. He stopped sleeping, stopped speaking to anyone but Finn. The possibility that Electra had been framed only deepened his torment. If she was innocent, then who had done this, and why use Luna's death to start a war? His heart told him to protect her, his mind told him to walk away. In the final twist of that brutal week, a security footage leak surfaced. It showed Luna's car being followed not by one vehicle, but two. The first matching the hitman's story, the second belonging to an unknown driver. The footage was grainy, but it proved one thing. Luna's death had been orchestrated, but the truth was far from clear. By then, the funeral had become legend, a moment when grief turned into spectacle and mourning became a trial. The chapel silence that day had fractured into echoes that would haunt both families for years to come. And as Will stood once more by Luna's grave under a gray morning sky, he realized the cruelest part of all. Even in death, Luna's presence still divided the living. The funeral that should have ended everything had only begun something far darker, a reckoning that would test every bond, every truth, and every illusion of loyalty the Forresters and Spencers had ever believed in. Each tear shed that day had become a weapon, and every whispered prayer had turned into a confession waiting to be twisted. Luna's body had been buried, but her death was far from over. The morning after the funeral, the city still trembled under the weight of whispers. The story of Luna's death, once wrapped in solemn tragedy, had mutated overnight into a spectacle of accusation and betrayal. Every headline screamed Electra's name. Every news anchor repeated the same chilling scene from the service. The man's confession, his unwavering tone, the collective gasp that froze the chapel. What no one saw was the silent implosion behind closed doors, the moment when grief began to rot into doubt, and love, once fierce, began to fracture under suspicion. Electra sat in the interrogation room under the harsh light, her reflection fractured in the one-way glass. Her wrists trembled against the cold steel of the table as she watched two detectives sift through her phone, her bank statements, her emails, every fragment of her life. They were polite, professional, almost sympathetic, but their eyes carried the quiet certainty of people who believed they had already found their culprit. The digital trail was damning. A string of transactions linked to an offshore account, each transferring money to the man who confessed. The timestamps matched the days before Luna's death. The sender's name? Electra Spencer. Her ID, her IP address, her authorization code. Even her voice print had been replicated in the banking verification audio. It was airtight. Too airtight. Outside, Will paced the hallway like a ghost trapped in motion. His father had taken control of the situation with the precision of a general preparing for war. Bill Spencer didn't do uncertainty. He did strategy, and his strategy was to find whoever had endangered his family. Yet for all his power and confidence, even Bill couldn't hide the tremor in his voice when he asked, "What if she really did it?" Will heard it, and it shattered him. Because deep down, he didn't know. The woman who stood beside him through his grief, the one who had wiped away his tears, who had whispered that Luna's death didn't have to define him, could she have been the one who made it happen? The thought felt like poison, and yet the evidence was undeniable. The detectives presented their findings to the press before the family could stop them. Every outlet reported the same explosive revelation: bank records, text messages, voice confirmations, all under Electra's name. The footage from the funeral replayed alongside images of her entering police headquarters, her face pale, her silence interpreted as guilt. The world had decided her story before she had a chance to speak it. The Forrestos issued a statement calling the allegations a coordinated smear campaign. The Spencers said nothing at all, which was worse. The silence from Will's family roared louder than any denial. But beneath the surface, something didn't fit. When the Cybercrime Division began digging deeper into the technical details, inconsistencies emerged. The transactions were real, but the device that had made them wasn't hers. The IP address traced back to a virtual server routed through 6 different countries. The physical device used was unregistered, its serial number erased. Even the voice authorization, the audio file that confirmed her identity, was not a live call but a composite, pieced together from public interviews and voice memos. Someone had built Electra's guilt out of fragments of her life. It wasn't merely framing, it was orchestration. Finn, who had joined the investigation unofficially out of loyalty to Luna, was the first to suspect that this went beyond personal vengeance. He noticed that whoever fabricated the trail knew far too much, details about both Spencer corporate infrastructure and Forrester financial systems that only a handful of people on either side could access. That realization turned the narrative upside down. Electra wasn't just an accused woman, she was bait. The question now wasn't whether she had killed Luna, but who wanted everyone to believe she had. At the Spencer estate, the atmosphere was suffocating. Bill had converted the living room into a crisis command center, surrounded by advisors, PR specialists, and lawyers. Will sat apart from them, staring into the fireplace, listening to their words without hearing them. Every mention of Electra's name tore at something inside him. His mind kept returning to the funeral, to the way she had frozen when accused, not out of guilt but disbelief. She had looked at him, eyes wide, lips trembling, as if begging him to recognize her truth. He wanted to believe her. He almost did. But then came the evidence, the perfect, clinical, undeniable evidence. It was too much for the heart to outweigh. That night, he found her alone in the guest room where she had been staying since the investigation began. She looked exhausted, her once polished poise replaced by something raw and human. "You think I did it," she said softly before he could speak. It wasn't a question. He didn't answer. Instead, he sat beside her, and for a moment, they were just 2 broken people trapped inside the machinery of something much larger than themselves. She reached for his hand, but he pulled away, not in anger, but in confusion. "I don't know what to think anymore," he whispered. "But someone wants me to doubt you. And I hate that it's working." Meanwhile, at Forrester Creations, tension brewed beneath the veneer of elegance. Ridge, Steffi, and Hope convened behind locked doors, whispering about the implications. If Electra had been framed, then someone was targeting not just her, but the families themselves. Luna's death was no longer just an accident. It was a lever in a corporate war. The timing was too convenient. Forrester's European expansion, Spencer Media's new venture, and the sudden reemergence of dormant stockholders all pointed to manipulation at a systemic level. Steffi's voice trembled as she said what no one else dared. "This isn't about Luna. This is about control." The phrase stuck. When investigators revisited the man who had confessed, they found his body in a motel outside the city, dead from an apparent overdose. His wallet was missing, his phone wiped. Officially, it was ruled a suicide. Unofficially, it was an execution. The only man who could have cleared Electra's name was gone, and the mystery deepened. But the real turning point came from an unexpected source, a digital forensic expert hired by Ridge in secret. Late one night, she discovered that one of the accounts used in the transfer matched a device previously registered under an internal Spencer corporate account. The credentials had been disguised, but not perfectly. The access path showed two distinct fingerprints, one Forrester, one Spencer. Whoever had done this had access to both empires, their financial DNA intertwined. It was someone who had studied both families for years, who knew their systems, their rivalries, their vulnerabilities. The realization shook Ridge to the core. Only a handful of people in Los Angeles could navigate those networks seamlessly, and every one of them had reason to want to see the Forresters and Spencers destroyed. Back at the Spencer estate, Will confronted his father. He asked, quietly but firmly, whether Bill could have enemies capable of such manipulation. Bill dismissed it at first, but the more he thought, the less certain he became. Over the years, he had made enemies in business, in politics, even within his own family. Someone could easily weaponize his son's grief and Elektra's reputation to destabilize both dynasties. Yet what haunted him most was the timing. Why now, and why Luna? In the days that followed, Elektra's image transformed in the public eye. At first, she was the villain, a woman so cold she'd ordered a murder out of jealousy. But as news of the compromised data spread, the story shifted. Some began to see her as the victim of an elaborate conspiracy. Still, the damage to her soul was irreversible. Everywhere she went, people stared. In her silence, tabloids painted her as calculating. In her anger, they painted her as unhinged. Will watched helplessly as she unraveled. Yet beneath the despair, something in her hardened, a quiet determination to prove her innocence. She began working with Ridge's investigator, tracing each transaction, every digital fingerprint. And the deeper they dug, the more they found evidence of something monstrous, a hidden network of shell companies connected to both families, moving money through fashion, media, and pharmaceuticals. The funds from Luna's murder had originated from one of these ghost accounts, an account tied to a now-defunct charitable foundation once co-owned by both Forrester Creations and Spencer Publications. The discovery redefined everything. Luna's death wasn't an isolated act of revenge. It was a cleansing. A message. Someone had used her as the first casualty in a campaign to destabilize the two most powerful families in Los Angeles. When Will learned this, something inside him broke again. But this time it wasn't grief, it was clarity. He saw how easily truth could be rewritten by power, how grief could be manipulated into spectacle. He began to question not only the people around him, but the structures that governed their lives. His father's empire, Forrester's dynasty, all of it seemed like a theater built on deception, and Luna's funeral had been the opening act. The final blow came when the investigator traced one of the ghost accounts to an offshore trust controlled by someone with ties to both families, a former Forrester executive who had once served as Spencer Media's financial consultant. A man fired years ago after a failed merger, a man who had vanished afterward, taking with him enough insider knowledge to destroy both houses. He had been quietly orchestrating financial sabotage for years, hiding behind digital walls, manipulating accounts, and feeding each side reasons to mistrust the other. It was he, not Elektra, who had paid the driver. It was he who had chosen Luna, because her death could fracture Will's heart, pull the Spencers and Forresters into chaos, and distract everyone from the real target, control of their company's combined assets. When the truth finally surfaced, it was too late for simple redemption. Elektra was free, but broken. Her name cleared, yet her reputation forever stained by the shadow of accusation. The press that once vilified her now hailed her as a victim of digital warfare, but sympathy came too late to heal the scars. Will, who had spent weeks doubting her, felt the weight of his failure like a chain around his chest. He went to her one evening as the sun set over the ocean, the light bleeding red across the horizon. She stood at the balcony, her face unreadable, the breeze lifting her hair like a veil. "You didn't believe me," she said quietly. "You thought I could kill for you." He had no defense. He only whispered, "I wanted to believe in something, and they used that." Their eyes met, filled with everything that could no longer be repaired. For all the truth they had uncovered, the damage to their souls was permanent. The world they lived in had turned mourning into spectacle, loyalty into currency, and love into collateral. When the case finally closed, it left behind no victors, only survivors. The real culprit died before trial, poisoned by his own accomplices. The network dissolved, leaving the two dynasties to pick through the ruins of trust. Bill withdrew from the public eye, Ridge redoubled his control over Forrester, and Will left the company entirely, haunted by what had been done in his name. As for Electra, she disappeared for a while. No press, no spotlight. Just silence. People whispered she left Los Angeles for good, retreating to somewhere no one could find her. But some claimed to have seen her months later in a small coastal town, working quietly, rebuilding a life that no longer required belief from anyone but herself. And sometimes, when Will looked at the horizon from the same balcony where she once stood, he wondered if the greatest tragedy of all wasn't Luna's death, but the realization that every act of love, every moment of trust, had been part of someone else's design. The funeral had begun as an ending, but in truth, it had been the beginning of a far greater reckoning. Luna's death exposed not only a murderer, but the fragile architecture of power and love in a world where even grief could be weaponized. The scars would remain, etched into the history of both families, a reminder that the dead were never truly gone, and that every secret, no matter how deeply buried, waits for its day to